The voice. You didn't choose. Right now, while you're reading these words, there is a voice running inside your head. It's commenting on what you're reading. It's judging whether this is worth your time. It's probably already forming an opinion about where this is going. And it started doing all of that before you consciously decided to let it. That voice is not you. That's the most important sentence in this entire book, and I want you to sit with it for a moment before we go any further. The voice in your head, the one that narrates your day, rehearses arguments you'll never actually have, critiques your appearance in the mirror before you've had your first cup of coffee. That voice is not you. It is a system, a deeply conditioned, extraordinarily powerful, often deceptive system that has been running the show while you believed you were in charge. Most people never discover this. They go through their entire lives fused with that voice, mistaking it for their identity, obeying its commands, believing its stories, suffering from its predictions. They think they're making decisions. They're not. They're executing the output of a mental program installed before they were old enough to choose what went into it. Here's what the research actually shows. Neuroscientists at Stanford studying decision-making found that the brain's activity pattern associated with a decision often precedes the person's conscious awareness of making that decision by several seconds. Several seconds. That means your body is moving toward a choice before you have officially decided anything. The decision-making process is largely happening in neural networks built on habit, conditioning, fear, and past experience. And consciousness is getting the press release after the fact. Think about what that means for your life. The job you stayed in too long, the relationship you couldn't leave, the dream you talked yourself out of before you even started, the harsh internal narrative that woke you up at 3 a.m., were any of those truly chosen? Or were they the output of a program running on software you never consciously installed? Psychologists have a term for what this book is about: cognitive defusion. It's a concept that comes from a branch of modern behavioral science called acceptance and commitment therapy, developed by Dr. Stephen Hayes at the University of Nevada. The core insight of cognitive defusion is deceptively simple but absolutely life-changing. You are not your thoughts. You are the one who notices them. Read that again, slowly. You are the one who notices them. There is a version of you that exists completely apart from the mental chatter, a version that can step back, observe the noise, and choose deliberately rather than react automatically. That version of you is not some spiritual concept or motivational fantasy. It is a neurological reality. It is accessible to you right now. And this book is going to show you exactly how to get there. But first, you need to understand the machine you're dealing with. Your mind is a magnificent servant and a catastrophic master. When directed deliberately, it is the most powerful creative force in the known universe. It can compose symphonies, engineer bridges, heal the body, and generate realities that didn't previously exist. But left unattended, left to run on its default programming, it becomes a prison that looks exactly like your life. The philosopher Blaise Pascal wrote in the 17th century that all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. He was 300 years ahead of the neuroscience, but he understood something fundamental. The undirected human mind defaults to suffering, to rumination, to threat scanning, to the mental equivalent of a car alarm that can't be turned off. The question this book answers is not whether you have this problem. Every human being on Earth has this problem. The question is what you are going to do about it, and whether you're willing to do the thing that most people find genuinely uncomfortable. Step outside your own story and look at it from the position of an observer rather than a prisoner. That is the essence of what you're about to learn. not how to think positive thoughts, not how to repeat affirmations until you believe them, not how to visualize your way to a parking spot. This is about something more fundamental, more precise, and far more transformative. Learning to relate to your thoughts differently so that they stop operating as invisible commands and start functioning as useful information you can evaluate, choose, and act on deliberately. The hidden influence your thoughts exert over your life is not a metaphor. It is biological, it is measurable, and it is changeable. Let's begin. The architecture of your inner world. Before you can change something, you need to understand how it was built. Your inner world, the specific quality of your mental experience, the recurring patterns of your thoughts, the emotional weather that follows you through your days, was not random. It was constructed piece by piece through a process that began before you had the cognitive capacity to evaluate what was going in. Here is the timeline that shaped you. From birth until approximately age 7, the human brain operates predominantly in slower brainwave states, theta and delta, which are the same states that modern neuroscience associates with high suggestibility and deep learning. A child in this state is, in a very real neurological sense, a recording device. Every message about the world, about relationships, about money, about what you deserve, about what is safe and what is dangerous, all of it was absorbed directly into the subconscious architecture without the filter of critical evaluation. Your parents, your teachers, your siblings, your neighborhood, your culture, they were all programming you, and none of them were licensed to do it. Most of them were operating from their own unexamined programming, passing forward the fears, limitations, and inherited narratives of their own childhoods. The person who told you that you weren't athletic enough probably heard the same thing about themselves at age 9. The culture that taught you success was only for certain kinds of people was itself operating from a story handed down through generations. This is not about blame. It is about understanding the mechanism, because once you understand how the architecture was built, you can rebuild it. Dr. Daniel Siegel, a clinical professor of psychiatry at UCLA and one of the leading researchers in interpersonal neurobiology, describes the mind as a self-organizing process that regulates the flow of energy and information. What this means in practical terms is that your mind is not a fixed thing. It is a process, and processes can be redirected. The brain contains somewhere in the range of 86 billion neurons, each capable of connecting with thousands of others. The resulting network, roughly 100 trillion connections, is not wired according to some genetic blueprint that locks you into a predetermined experience. It is wired according to use. Neurons that fire together wire together. The thoughts you think most frequently become the roads that your brain travels automatically. The beliefs you rehearse most consistently become the lens through which you interpret every new experience. This is simultaneously the most troubling and the most exciting fact about human cognition. Troubling because it means that every time you've ruminated over a failure, replayed a humiliation, or reinforced a belief that you're not enough, you've been strengthening those exact neural pathways, making those patterns faster and more automatic. Exciting because it means every time you practice a new way of thinking, you are literally building new infrastructure in your brain. The question is not whether your mind can change. The question is whether you're changing it on purpose or by accident. Most people are doing it by accident. They wake up in the morning and immediately begin running the same program they ran yesterday, and the day before, and the year before. Dr. Joe Dispenza's research on neurological habits suggests that by the time most adults reach their mid-30s, roughly 95% of their daily mental activity consists of memorized programs. automatic responses, habitual emotional reactions, and hardwired interpretations of reality that were installed years or decades earlier. 95%. That means the vast majority of what you experience as your perspective, your personality, your natural reactions is actually just old software running. The 5% of you that is genuinely choosing in any given moment is fighting upstream against an enormous current of automation. But here is what cognitive diffusion offers. That simple willpower does not. Instead of fighting the current, you learn to step out of the river entirely. You learn to observe the current from the bank. From that position, you are no longer being carried by thoughts you didn't consciously choose. You are watching them, evaluating them, and deciding which ones deserve to direct your life. The inner world you have right now is not your fault, but the inner world you maintain from this point forward is entirely your responsibility. How your mind constructs reality. Here is a fact that will rearrange the way you see everything. You have never directly experienced reality, not once, not even right now. What you experience as reality is your brain's best guess, a sophisticated internal model constructed from incomplete sensory data, filtered through your beliefs, colored by your emotional state, and assembled so seamlessly that it feels like direct perception. It is not. It is interpretation all the way down. Your eyes do not see the world. They detect light frequencies and send electrical signals to your visual cortex, which constructs a representation. Your ears do not hear sound. They detect vibration and pass information to processing centers that generate the experience of sound. Every single piece of sensory input your brain receives is raw data that gets processed, filtered, and assembled into the experience you call what's happening right now. The critical question is, what does the filtering? The answer is your existing mental models, your beliefs, your expectations, your dominant thought patterns, and your emotional state in the moment. Your brain is not a passive camera recording events neutrally. It is an active prediction machine, constantly generating hypotheses about what is likely to happen next based on what has happened before, and then using incoming sensory data primarily to confirm or update those predictions. Dr. Carl Friston, a neuroscientist at University College London whose work on predictive processing has reshaped the field, describes the brain as fundamentally a prediction engine. His research suggests that perception is not bottom-up, starting with raw data and building up to a conclusion. It is top-down, starting with a prediction derived from prior experience and only updating that prediction when incoming data is surprising enough to warrant it. Translation: your brain is extremely reluctant to change its model of reality. It sees what it expects to see. It hears what it expects to hear. And the expectations doing the filtering were largely installed in that theta state childhood we discussed in the previous chapter. This is not a design flaw. In a world where rapid threat assessment was necessary for survival, a brain that constantly questioned its own model of reality would be dangerously slow. The prediction engine evolved because it worked. It kept humans alive long enough to reproduce. But in the modern world, this same mechanism keeps successful executives trapped in the belief that they are frauds, keeps talented artists convinced that their work has no value, keeps loving people stuck in the conviction that they are fundamentally unlovable. The model was built in a different world. It is running in yours. There is a famous psychological principle called the reticular activating system, the RAS, which functions as the brain's attention filter. Of the estimated 11 million bits of information per second that your senses are processing, your conscious mind handles roughly 40. The RAS decides which 40 and what determines its selection criteria. Your dominant beliefs and current focus. This is why a new parent suddenly notices babies everywhere in a city they've lived in for years. The babies were always there. The RAS simply wasn't filtering for them. This is why a person convinced that the world is dangerous keeps experiencing and noticing danger. Not because the world is objectively more dangerous for them, but because their RAS is programmed to surface confirming evidence. You are not perceiving your circumstances. You are perceiving your expectations about your circumstances. The world you experience is, in a very real sense, a collaboration between external events and internal programming. This understanding carries enormous implications for change. If you try to improve your life while leaving your mental model of reality intact, you will find yourself constantly recycling familiar experiences. You might change the surface details, new job, new city, new relationship, while the underlying program faithfully reconstructs variations of the same emotional themes. Real change requires updating the model, and the first step toward updating the model is recognizing that it is a model, not reality itself. Your thoughts about your situation are not your situation. Your interpretation of a conflict is not the conflict. Your belief about what is possible for your life is not a fact about what is possible. It is a cognitive map, and cognitive maps can be redrawn. Escaping the mental autopilot. There is a highway in your brain that runs straight from your bedroom to your morning coffee maker without your conscious involvement. You have driven it thousands of times. Every decision along that route, when to sit, which cabinet to open, how to hold the mug, has been automated to the point of near invisibility. Your conscious mind is entirely free to dwell on yesterday's argument, tomorrow's presentation, or the fact that you desperately need to call your mother back. The body knows the route. This is neurological efficiency at its finest. And it is, in the domain of physical habits, almost entirely beneficial. You do not want to consciously direct every muscle movement involved in walking. The automation is the gift. The problem is that the same automation applies to your mental life, to your emotional responses, your self-perception, your assumptions about what other people mean, your judgments about your own capability. And in that domain, running on autopilot is not a gift. It is the mechanism of limitation. Psychologists at Harvard conducted a study using experience sampling, essentially interrupting people at random intervals during the day with a simple question. Are you thinking about something other than what you're currently doing? The results were striking. Adults reported mind wandering, operating on mental autopilot, roughly 47% of the time. Nearly half of every waking day is spent not in the present moment, but navigating an internal world of automatic thought. More troubling, the study found that mind-wandering consistently correlated with lower happiness ratings, regardless of what activity the person was engaged in. People were less happy when their minds were elsewhere, even when the elsewhere was something pleasant. The quality of present experience appears to require present attention, and present attention is precisely what automatic thinking displaces. But the deeper issue is not happiness, it is agency. When you are running on autopilot, you are not choosing your thoughts. Your thoughts are running you. The mental program inherited from your conditioning, the fears, the fixed stories, the ingrained interpretations, is executing without your review or consent. And because it feels like thinking, because the stream of internal narrative is continuous and seamlessly woven into your experience. Most people never notice that they are not the author of this process. They are the audience. Cognitive defusion offers a specific and trainable alternative to autopilot operation, the practice of noticing thoughts as thoughts rather than as transparent windows onto reality. Consider the difference between two ways of experiencing the same thought. In the first mode, you have the thought, I'm going to fail at this. You feel it as truth. Your body responds. Accordingly, heart rate shifts, stomach tightens, attention narrows. You begin behaving as someone who is going to fail. The thought functions as a command. In the second mode, you notice there's a thought that says, I'm going to fail. You observe it from one step back. You can acknowledge that the thought is present without treating it as a reliable report on the future. You can ask, is this accurate? Useful? Does this deserve to direct my behavior right now? The thought functions as information, subject to evaluation. The distance between these two modes is not a philosophical nicety. It is the difference between being controlled by your conditioning and directing your life from a position of genuine choice. The neuroscience behind this capacity is clear and encouraging. The prefrontal cortex, the brain's executive center, responsible for deliberate decision-making, impulse regulation, and long-term planning, is the biological substrate of the observing perspective. When you activate deliberate self-reflection, you literally engage different neural circuitry than when you are running automatically. Here's what's remarkable. The prefrontal cortex can be strengthened. Like a muscle, it responds to training. Research on mindfulness-based interventions consistently shows that regular practice of present-moment awareness and deliberate observation of mental activity produces measurable increases in prefrontal cortex gray matter density within weeks. You can literally build a bigger, stronger observing mind through practice. The autopilot can be interrupted, and once interrupted consistently, the habits underlying it begin to lose their power over you. The observer who sets you free. In the world of cognitive defusion, there is a distinction that changes everything once you truly internalize it: the difference between the thinking self and the observing self. The thinking self is the voice, the narrator, the part of you that is constantly producing commentary, judgment, analysis, anticipation, regret, planning, rehearsal, and story. It is relentlessly active. It has an opinion about everything. It speaks in the first person and claims to be you. It is not you. The observing self is the awareness behind the thinking, the stable, silent witness that notices thought arising. It is the part of you that can read a sentence like, "There is a voice in my head," and immediately recognize what that points to. It is the part of you that has been present and aware throughout every moment of your conscious life, regardless of what the thinking self was doing at the time. Dr. Stephen Hayes, who developed acceptance and commitment therapy, describes the observing self as a vantage point rather than a thing. You cannot be hurt by noticing. You cannot fail at observing. The observing self is not damaged by difficult thoughts because it is not the same thing as those thoughts. It is the context in which they occur, the sky in which every emotional weather pattern moves. This is not mysticism. It is a trainable attentional capacity with a rich scientific literature behind it. Researchers call it metacognition, thinking about thinking. And it is one of the most robustly studied interventions in modern psychology. Studies across multiple countries, demographics, and clinical populations consistently show that developing metacognitive awareness reduces the impact of negative thought patterns, improves emotional regulation, decreases symptoms of anxiety and depression, and increases the quality of decision-making. The practice of accessing the observing self is simpler than most people expect, and more immediately available than any technique requiring years of dedicated training. Here is a starting point. Close your eyes for a moment and try to locate the voice in your head. Not to silence it, just to notice it. Notice that it says things. Notice that the things it says have a particular tone, a particular content, particular recurring themes. Notice that you can notice this, that there is something in you that is separate from the voice, watching it, That something is the observing self. And the moment you locate it, even briefly, even partially, everything starts to shift. Because once you find the observer, you realize something that your thinking mind has been carefully preventing you from seeing. You have a relationship with your thoughts. They are not you. They are events in your awareness, and events can be responded to differently depending on where you are standing when they arrive. Think about the difference between standing inside a thunderstorm and watching a thunderstorm from a window. The storm is the same storm, but your experience of it, and crucially your available range of responses, is dramatically different depending on your position. Cognitive diffusion teaches you to find the window, not to deny the storm, not to pretend the thunder isn't real, but to engage with it from a position where you are not simply being pounded by it. This has direct practical implications for the patterns that have most reliably limited your life. The thought, "I always mess things up." When you are fused with it, it functions as identity. You are the person who always messes things up. When you are diffused from it, it becomes data. There is a thought arising that says, "I always mess things up." Is this literally true? What would a trusted friend say about this? Claim? What is this thought asking me to do, and is that something I actually want to do? The thought loses its automatic command authority. It doesn't disappear, necessarily, but it stops being the invisible director of your behavior. Here is a technique directly from the ACT research literature called deliteralization. When a particularly powerful limiting thought arises, mentally add the phrase, "I am having the thought that," before it. "I am having the thought that I will never be good enough." The simple act of labeling the thought as a thought, rather than a fact, creates measurable psychological distance. Research by Dr. Russ Harris, one of the leading practitioners of ACT in the United States, shows that this technique reduces the believability of unhelpful thoughts and their behavioral influence, often within a single session of practice. You don't need to argue the thought away. You don't need to replace it with a positive alternative. You simply need to see it clearly for what it is, a thought, not a decree, not a truth, a thought. The observer within you has always known this. It has been waiting, patiently, for the thinking mind to stop long enough to let you find it. Rewiring the brain. You inherited, you did not choose the brain you were given. But you are choosing every single day the brain you are keeping. This is not a metaphor. Neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to physically restructure itself based on experience and directed thought, is one of the most important scientific discoveries of the last 50 years. Before this understanding took hold in the neuroscience community in the 1990s, the prevailing assumption was that the adult brain was largely fixed, a hardware system that could learn new software but couldn't change its underlying architecture. We now know this is wrong. Your brain is changing right now. As you read these sentences, neural connections are being made, strengthened, or allowed to weaken based on where your attention is directed and what you are rehearsing mentally. The experience of reading and engaging with a new idea is, at the cellular level, a construction project. You are building new pathways. The neurological principle underlying this is often summarized as neurons that fire together wire together, a formulation derived from the work of Canadian psychologist Donald Hebb in 1949. When two neurons activate simultaneously, their connection is strengthened. When a thought pattern is repeated, the neural sequence it runs on becomes faster, more automatic, and energetically cheaper for the brain to execute. This is why habits of thought feel effortless. They have been optimized by repetition into low-energy superhighways. But the same mechanism that locked in your old patterns can unlock new ones. Research by Dr. Michael Merzenich at the University of California, San Francisco, one of the pioneers of neuroplasticity research, has shown that targeted cognitive practice can produce measurable changes in brain structure within weeks, not months, weeks. The brain does not require years to begin reorganizing itself around new patterns of thought and attention. It requires consistency, intensity, and the element that most people underestimate: emotional engagement. Emotion is the brain's marking system. Experiences tagged with strong emotion are processed differently than neutral ones. They're encoded more deeply, recalled more readily, and given greater weight in the prediction engine we discussed earlier. This is why a single humiliating experience at age 12 can still generate a physical stress response at age 40. The emotional tag made it stick. The practical implication: if you want to install new neural patterns, you need more than repetition. You need repetition with emotional engagement. Affirmations spoken flatly, without internal feeling, barely register in the brain's prioritization system, but affirmations spoken from a genuine state of emotional resonance, accompanied by the bodily sensation of what it would actually feel like to embody that belief, carry the neurological weight needed to begin competing with old programming. This is why the most effective forms of mental reprogramming combine multiple elements simultaneously: clear visualization, physical relaxation, emotional elevation, and present tense focus. The combination accesses multiple encoding systems at once: visual, somatic, emotional, narrative, and creates what researchers call multimodal memory traces, which are substantially more durable than single-channel encoding. The window for this kind of deep installation is also well documented. In the 20 minutes before you fall asleep and the 20 minutes after you wake up, your brain naturally cycles into alpha and theta brainwave states, the same slow, highly receptive states that characterized childhood learning. During these windows, the critical filters of the fully alert, conscious mind are lowered, and new information can be encoded more directly into the subconscious layer. This is when the real reprogramming happens. Not in the middle of a busy day when your beta-state analytical mind is running at full capacity. In the liminal spaces between waking and sleeping, when the brain is most open to rewriting. There is one more critical factor in rewiring the brain you inherited: the environment you choose to inhabit. Your mirror neurons, specialized brain cells that activate both when you perform an action and when you observe someone else performing it, mean that your brain is constantly being programmed by the behavior and mental states of people around you. This is not metaphor or social influence theory. It is cellular. The people you spend time with are literally programming your neural patterns through the mechanism of mirror neuron activation. Choose your environment as if your brain depends on it, because it does. The quantum dimension of thought. What you are about to read sits at the intersection of hard physics and human consciousness. And while some of it remains genuinely contested at the frontier of science, the implications are too significant and too relevant to leave out. Let's start with what is not contested. At the quantum level, the fabric of physical reality behaves in ways that are deeply strange by the standards of everyday experience. Particles exist in what physicists call superposition, simultaneously inhabiting multiple possible states, until the moment of measurement. The famous double-slit experiment, replicated thousands of times in laboratories around the world, demonstrates that a single electron fired at a barrier with two openings will pass through both simultaneously, creating an interference pattern on a detector screen, until an observer attempts to measure which slit it actually passed through. At that moment, the interference pattern disappears, and the electron behaves as if it passed through only one slit. The act of observation appears to influence the behavior of the thing being observed at the most fundamental level of matter. This is not a philosophical interpretation. It is an experimental result that has resisted every attempt to explain it away through classical physics. Dr. John Wheeler, one of the great physicists of the 20th century and a collaborator of Albert Einstein, spent the latter decades of his career developing what he called the participatory universe. The idea that consciousness is not a passive observer of an independently existing reality, but an active participant in bringing specific aspects of that reality into definite form. He coined the phrase "it from bit," the radical suggestion that information and observation are foundational to physical existence. Here is where this becomes relevant to you and your daily life. If the universe at its most fundamental level is responsive to the act of observation, if the collapse of possibility into actuality is, in some meaningful sense, connected to the presence of consciousness, then your thoughts are not merely internal events with purely internal consequences. They may be participating in the selection of possibilities from a field of infinite potential. This is not a claim that you can visualize a parking spot and physics will cooperate. The mechanism is subtle, probabilistic, and operates at levels far below ordinary conscious intention. But the broader principle, that your consciousness is not a passive spectator of reality, but an active participant in shaping it, is consistent with both cutting-edge physics and with what every contemplative tradition in human history has pointed toward from the opposite direction. Dr. Amit Goswami, a quantum physicist at the University of Oregon, argues in his research that consciousness is not produced by the brain. It is the ground state from which the brain and everything else emerges. On this view, your thoughts are not just biochemical events happening inside a skull. They are expressions of a fundamental creative force that the universe is made of. You don't need to accept any of this on philosophical grounds to apply its practical implications. Consider what it means at a purely psychological level. If you truly understood, not as a slogan but as a lived conviction, that your dominant beliefs and expectations are actively participating in the construction of your experienced reality, would you choose them more carefully? The quantum field of possibility is, metaphorically at least, responding to the frequency of your consciousness. Thoughts saturated with fear, scarcity, and limitation create a perceptual environment that selects for confirming experiences. Not because the universe is punishing you, but because your prediction engine, operating at quantum speed, is constantly sampling the environment for what it has been primed to find. Thoughts saturated with possibility, gratitude, and expansion create a different environment. They prime a different prediction engine. They filter for different evidence. They attract different attention, different decisions, different conversations, different opportunities, not through magic, but through the extraordinarily powerful and underappreciated mechanism of directed consciousness. The quantum dimension of thought is not a license for magical thinking. It is an invitation to take the quality of your inner life as seriously as you take any other aspect of the world you are trying to build, dissolving the beliefs that cage. You, every person on earth, is living inside a story, not a story they chose, not a story that is necessarily true, but a story that feels so seamlessly like reality that most people never step back far enough to notice it is a story at all. The story goes something like this. Here is what I am like. Here is what I am capable of. Here is what the world does to people like me. Here is what success requires, and here is whether I have it. Here is what I deserve. This story, this complex, internally consistent, constantly self-referencing narrative structure, is what psychologists call your belief system, and it functions less like a collection of opinions you hold and more like the operating system on which your entire cognitive life runs. Beliefs are not just thoughts. They are thoughts that have been thought so frequently and confirmed so consistently through the lens of the prediction engine that they have calcified into assumed facts. The person who believes they are not intelligent does not think of this as a belief. They experience it as a simple description of reality. The belief is invisible to them precisely because it has become the water they swim in. Dr. Aaron Beck, the psychiatrist who founded cognitive behavioral therapy and reshaped modern psychology in the process, identified a category he called core beliefs, deeply held convictions about self, others, and the world that function as master templates for interpreting all experience. His clinical research showed that virtually all chronic psychological suffering, depression, anxiety, persistent low self-esteem, is organized around a small number of core negative beliefs, typically of the form: I am defective, I am helpless, I am unlovable. These beliefs do not sit in the mind passively. They actively recruit evidence. They filter perception to confirm themselves. They generate automatic thoughts that are consistent with their content and suppress awareness of contradictory information. A person with the core belief, I am fundamentally incompetent, will minimize genuine successes, amplify failures, interpret neutral feedback as criticism, and construct a life experience that seems to prove over and over that the belief is true. The cage is invisible, and it has been built with extraordinary precision using the most powerful materials available. Your own nervous system's confirmed predictions. Dissolving these beliefs requires a process that operates at multiple levels simultaneously. The first level is intellectual, recognizing the belief as a belief rather than a fact. This sounds simple. It is not. The diffusion practice we discussed earlier is the essential gateway here. Before you can change what you believe, you must be able to step outside it long enough to see it as a belief at all. For many people, this first step alone is catalytic. The second level is evidentiary. Most limiting beliefs are generalized conclusions drawn from limited, often outdated samples of experience. The person who believes they always fail at relationships may have had 2 or 3 significant relationship failures and, through a predictable process of cognitive distortion called overgeneralization, has drawn a universal conclusion from a partial data set. The clinical intervention here is straightforward. Examine the evidence, not to argue yourself into false positivity, but to require that the belief meet a basic standard of logical validity. Does the evidence actually support the universal claim? What counter-evidence has been systematically filtered out? The third level is somatic. Beliefs are not only cognitive structures, they are held in the body. The posture of the person who believes they are small is different from the posture of someone who believes they belong. The breathing pattern of chronic anxiety is different from the breathing pattern of genuine confidence. Research in embodied cognition demonstrates that the body and mind are bidirectional. Not only does mental state influence physical state, but physical state influences mental state with equal power. Changing your posture, your breathing, your movement, adopting the physical signature of the belief you want to install, is not a performance. It is a genuine neurological intervention. Your nervous system uses proprioceptive data from the body as evidence about your internal state. Give it different data, and it begins updating the model. The fourth level is experiential. Some beliefs can only be dissolved by acting against them and surviving. The belief that public speaking will destroy you cannot be fully dissolved by thinking about it differently. At some point, you have to speak publicly and discover that you survived. and that the catastrophe the belief predicted did not materialize. The belief cracks under the weight of real experience that contradicts it. This is why the most comprehensive belief change programs combine cognitive work, somatic practice, and what psychologists call behavioral experiments, small, structured actions designed to generate evidence that challenges the limiting belief in the real world. The cage is real, but it was built by a mind that was doing its best with what it had, under conditions it didn't choose, and the same mind, now more resourced, more aware, and more intentional, can dismantle every bar, one deliberate choice at a time. The mastery of emotional weather. Your emotions are not random. They are not uncontrollable forces that happen to you from the outside, and they are not permanent features of your personality that you simply have to learn to live with. Your emotions are biochemical events triggered by thoughts, and because thoughts can be related to differently, emotions can be experienced differently. This is not emotional suppression, it is emotional literacy. And the difference between the two is the difference between a thermometer and a thermostat. Here is the chain reaction that most people never see clearly. An event occurs. Before conscious evaluation, the brain runs the event through its pattern-matching library, comparing it to similar past experiences, particularly emotionally significant ones. The match generates an automatic interpretation. The interpretation triggers a neurochemical cascade. Within milliseconds, cortisol or dopamine or adrenaline is flooding your bloodstream. Seconds later, you experience what feels like an emotional response to the event. But what you are actually experiencing is your brain's interpretation of the event, filtered through your conditioning, expressed biochemically. The event did not create your emotion. Your model of the event created your emotion. And models can be updated. Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett, a neuroscientist at Northeastern University, whose work has fundamentally challenged the classical view of emotion, argues in her research that emotions are not universal biological programs that are triggered by circumstances. They are constructed, assembled in the moment from a combination of sensory data, conceptual knowledge, and prediction. She calls this theory constructed emotion, and the evidence for it is substantial. What this means practically is that your emotional experience is far more malleable than the sensation of being controlled by it suggests. The same event, a critical comment from a colleague, a rejection letter, a silence in a conversation, can generate entirely different emotional constructions depending on the concept your brain reaches for to categorize the experience. Labeled as attack, it generates threat. Labeled as feedback, it generates curiosity. Labeled as information, it generates problem-solving engagement. You are not choosing your emotions consciously in most moments, but you are building the conceptual library from which your brain constructs them. Train the concepts and you train the emotions. This is where the practice of cognitive defusion becomes directly relevant to emotional experience. When you are fully fused with a thought, when you experience it as transparent reality rather than as a mental construction, the emotion it triggers is experienced as a direct response to objective events. The suffering is total. The emotion is you, and you are the emotion. When you are diffused, when you can observe the thought from the position of the observing self, you create space between the stimulus and the response. Viktor Frankl, who survived the Nazi concentration camps and went on to found logotherapy, described this space as the ultimate human freedom, the ability to choose your response to any circumstance. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space lies your freedom. The neuroscience of that space is now well understood. The space Frankl described is created by the engagement of the prefrontal cortex, the brain's executive center, in the moment when automatic reactivity would otherwise take over. Mindfulness practices strengthen this capacity by repeatedly exercising the neural pathway between the triggering event and the deliberate response, making the gap more available and more reliable under pressure. Emotional mastery is not about feeling only positive emotions. That is not mastery. It is avoidance. Genuine emotional mastery involves the capacity to fully experience the complete range of human feeling, grief, anger, fear, longing, joy, without being dominated by any of it. To feel an emotion as a wave that passes through the body of the observer, rather than as a flood that submerges the observer entirely. The storms will come. They are part of being alive, but you are not the storm. You are the sky. Visualization as neural engineering. In 1995, researchers at Harvard Medical School published results from a study that permanently changed the scientific understanding of mental practice. Two groups of volunteers learned a simple 5-finger piano sequence. One group practiced it physically for 2 hours every day for 5 days. The other group sat at the piano with their hands in their laps and mentally rehearsed the sequence, imagining the finger movements, the sound, the physical sensation, for the same amount of time without touching the keys. At the end of 5 days, brain scans using transcranial magnetic stimulation revealed that both groups had developed virtually identical changes in the motor cortex of their brains, the region responsible for controlling the finger movements in question. The group that had never physically played had built essentially the same neural infrastructure as the group that had. The mind had done what the hands had done. The brain had physically changed without a single actual keystroke. This finding has been replicated, extended, and built upon in dozens of subsequent studies, across domains from surgery to sports to musical performance to cognitive rehabilitation after stroke. The mechanism is now well understood. Vivid, detailed mental rehearsal activates the same neural networks as physical performance. The brain, for the purposes of laying down neural pathways, does not require the actual event. It requires the detailed simulation. This is not a marginal effect or a statistical curiosity. It is one of the most robustly demonstrated phenomena in cognitive neuroscience, and it has profound implications for how you build the life you want. The key word is vivid. Not visualization in the sense of vaguely wishing for something while picturing it dimly. Visualization as full sensory simulation, engaging sight, sound, touch, smell, the kinesthetic sense of moving through space, and most critically, the specific emotional texture of the experience you are rehearsing. When the emotional component is present and genuine, the neural encoding is deeper, the RAS. Priming is stronger, and the behavioral preparation is more complete. Elite performers in virtually every high-stakes domain use some version of this practice as standard preparation. The mental walkthrough before the performance is not superstition, it is applied neuroscience. But here is what most self-help discussions of visualization leave out. What you visualize matters differently depending on how you do it. Research by Dr. Gabriele Oettingen at New York University on a process she calls mental contrasting reveals that visualizing only the positive outcome, the success, the achievement, the ideal state, can actually reduce motivation and decrease the likelihood of action. The brain, exposed repeatedly to a vividly imagined positive future, can experience a version of premature closure, a sense that the goal has already been achieved, which reduces the motivational tension necessary to drive actual behavior. The most effective visualization combines the positive outcome with a clear, honest mental rehearsal of the obstacles that stand between here and there. Dr. Oettingen's WOOP model, wish, outcome, obstacle, plan, directs you to vividly imagine both the desired future and the specific challenges you will face, then mentally rehearse your response to those challenges. This combination creates forward momentum without the deflation of premature completion. Effective visualization also requires attention to the perspective from which you visualize. Research distinguishes between first-person visualization, experiencing the scenario from inside your own body through your own eyes, and third-person visualization, watching yourself in the scene from an external vantage point. For skill development and behavioral preparation, first-person visualization is consistently more effective because it engages the motor and sensory systems more directly. The practice of future memory creation is among the most powerful advanced techniques. Instead of visualizing a future event as something that hasn't happened yet, you rehearse it as a memory of something that has already occurred, complete with the felt sense of completion, the detail of specific moments, and the emotional resonance of genuine recollection. You are essentially writing new memory files for your brain to use as reference material. Your brain does not tag memories as real or imagined in the moment of neural encoding. It tags them as emotionally significant or not. Emotionally significant enough and vividly rendered, an imagined experience becomes part of your experiential reference library, and your behavior, your confidence, your sense of familiarity with success begins to update accordingly. Neural engineering, not wishful thinking, breaking the thought loops. On any given day, your mind generates somewhere between 60 and 80,000 thoughts. Research suggests that in most adults, approximately 80% of these thoughts are negative, in valence, and roughly 95% are repetitive. The same thoughts, recycling through the same pathways, producing the same emotional weather, day after day after year after decade. Let that land for a moment. The vast majority of your mental life is a loop, an automated, self-referencing, largely negative loop that has been running for so long that most people experience it not as a loop, but simply as the way things are. They don't recognize the thought, "I'm not good enough at this," as the 10,000th repetition of a worn pathway. They experience it as a fresh, accurate assessment of their current situation. This is the tyranny of the thought loop, and breaking free from it requires understanding both how the loops form and why the standard advice for dealing with them almost always fails. Standard advice: think positive thoughts. Replace the negative narrative with an affirmative one. When the voice says you're not good enough, argue back. Tell it you are enough. Repeat as necessary. This approach fails for a neurologically predictable reason. The brain operates on something called ironic process theory, first documented by psychologist Daniel Wegner in his landmark white bear experiments. When you instruct yourself not to think of something, the monitoring system your brain employs to check whether you're succeeding must hold a representation of the forbidden thought active in working memory. The very act of monitoring creates the thing it's monitoring for. Tell yourself not to think about the worry. Notice the worry. Tell yourself not to think the negative thought. Notice the thought. This is not weakness. This is how the monitoring mechanism works. This is precisely why cognitive defusion works where thought suppression fails. Defusion doesn't attempt to eliminate the thought or replace it with its opposite. It changes your relationship to the thought, from fusion to observation, from identification to witnessing. The loop may continue running, but you step off the conveyor belt. The loop runs, but you are no longer on it, being carried by it. A specific and practical diffusion technique for thought loops is what therapists call cognitive labeling. When you notice a recurring negative thought pattern, you give it a name, something slightly absurd and slightly affectionate, which creates distance without hostility. Oh, there's the fraud police again. Hello, catastrophe casting department. This looks like the not enough channel. The labeling does two things simultaneously. It creates the cognitive distance of diffusion, reminding you that this is a pattern you have identified, not a reality you are experiencing. And it introduces a small element of humor, which neurologically activates a different brain circuitry than the original anxious content, gently disrupting the loop's momentum. Another powerful technique for breaking thought loops is what neurobiologist Dr. Daniel Siegel calls RAIN: recognize, allow, investigate, nurture. You recognize what is happening in your mind without judgment. You allow it to be there. Resistance creates persistence. You investigate it with genuine curiosity. Where is this coming from? What does it actually mean? What is it trying to protect? And you nurture the part of you experiencing this with the warmth you would offer a struggling friend. RAIN is not just a cognitive technique. It is a relational practice. It changes how you relate to the internal experience rather than attempting to eliminate it. And this relational change is exactly what breaks the loop. The loop's power comes from the urgency with which you respond to it. Bring curiosity and warmth to it instead of fear and resistance, and the urgency dissolves. There is one more factor in breaking thought loops that is rarely discussed in cognitive approaches: the somatic component. Thought loops are not just neurological events. They are stored in the body, in habitual patterns of tension, breathing restriction, and postural collapse that both reflect and reinforce the mental pattern. The loop has a physical home. Somatic practices, breathwork, body scanning, intentional movement, progressive muscle relaxation, address the physical dimension of thought loops directly. When you release the physical tension associated with a loop, the mental component loses part of its substrate. The physical and mental patterns maintain each other, and disrupting either one creates the possibility of disrupting both. Breaking thought loops is not a one-time event. It is a practice, a daily, ongoing commitment to noticing the loops as they arise and stepping off them with skill and consistency. Over time, the loops genuinely weaken. The neural pathways underlying them thin from disuse. New pathways, laid down through consistent practice of observation and diffusion, become the brain's preferred routes. The loops can be broken. One moment of noticing at a time. The science of intention. There is a difference between wanting something and intending it. Wanting is passive. It is an orientation of desire that leaves the future open and undecided, contingent on external circumstances cooperating. Wanting is experienced in a state of absence. The thing is not here, and the consciousness of not having it creates a subtle but persistent background of lack. Intention is something else entirely. Intention is a decisive commitment of your consciousness toward a specific outcome, not wishing it into existence, but aligning every level of your being toward its creation and taking full ownership of the gap between here and there. Dr. Ellen Langer, a professor of psychology at Harvard and one of the most influential researchers in the field of mindful intention, has spent decades studying what she calls the psychology of possibility. Her landmark study with nursing home residents in the 1970s found that elderly men given control over their environment and encouraged to make decisions and maintain active intention in their daily lives showed significant improvements in physical health, cognitive function, and longevity compared to a control group. The intention, the active, engaged orientation toward life, was literally biological. The neuroscience of intention reveals why this is. When you hold a clear intention, your reticular activating system is primed differently. Your attention filters shift. You begin noticing opportunities, resources, and information consistent with your intention that would previously have been filtered out. Your behavioral repertoire expands because you are now oriented toward the intention rather than simply reacting to immediate stimuli. The intention organizes your cognitive and behavioral resources around a focal point. This is not law of attraction mysticism. It is attention management at a systematic level. The most powerful intentions share several characteristics, all of which are supported by the research literature. They are specific. Vague intentions create vague attentional priming and vague behavioral organization. I want to be more successful is not an intention, it is a wish. I am building a business that generates $200,000 in annual revenue by helping small companies improve their digital marketing is an intention specific enough to prime the prediction engine for the relevant opportunities, information, and decisions. They are emotionally resonant. As we've discussed, the brain's encoding and prioritization systems run on emotional significance. An intention that is intellectually held but emotionally flat will not carry sufficient neurological weight to compete with your existing programming. You need to be able to feel the intention to access, even briefly, the emotional signature of having already achieved it. They exist in present tense language. The subconscious mind does not navigate toward future states effectively. It responds to present state representations. I will be confident orients the mind toward a future that is not now. I am developing genuine confidence positions the intention as a current reality in process, and the mind organizes around it accordingly. They are revisited daily. The power of intention is cumulative and depends on consistent reinforcement. Setting an intention once and returning to it a month later barely registers against the momentum of existing programming. The most effective practice is a brief but genuine daily renewal, reconnecting with the intention, feeling its emotional resonance, and reorienting your day around its direction. One of the most interesting research areas in intention science involves what happens when intentions are held collectively. Dr. Roger Nelson's Global Consciousness Project has gathered data suggesting that when large numbers of people focus their collective attention on the same event, statistical anomalies appear in random number generators around the world, anomalies that cannot be explained by any known conventional mechanism. The data remains controversial, but the underlying question it raises is not whether consciousness is purely individual or whether it operates in ways that extend beyond the boundaries of a single skull. What is clear at the level of human groups is that shared intention creates measurable social effects far beyond what individual intentions produce. Mastermind groups, accountability partnerships, and group meditation practices consistently outperform individual practice, not just because of social support, but because something in the collective focus amplifies individual outcomes. Your intentions are not private events with private consequences. They radiate. They influence the environment you create around you, the people you attract and repel, the conversations you initiate, and the opportunities you position yourself to receive. Intention is not hoping. It is a declaration that your consciousness is making about which possibilities it is choosing to collapse from the field of infinite potential into your specific lived reality. Present moment as creative ground. You cannot create your future from the past, but most people spend the overwhelming majority of their mental energy trying to do exactly that. The architecture of the human brain is biased toward temporal displacement. The default mode network, the neural circuitry that activates when you are not focused on a specific external task, is primarily engaged in mental time travel. Replaying the past, simulating the future, narrating a story about yourself in time. This network is deeply connected to the sense of self, the ongoing internal autobiography that your mind is constantly composing. It is also, research consistently shows, the primary generator of human suffering. Studies by Matthew Killingsworth and Daniel Gilbert at Harvard, published in Science, found that the human mind is wandering approximately half the time, and that this wandering is reliably associated with lower well-being, regardless of the content of the wandering. People were less happy when their minds were elsewhere, even when elsewhere was pleasant. The quality of being present, of having your attention synchronized with your actual experience in real time, is independently associated with well-being, separate from any particular circumstance. But the case for present moment awareness goes beyond well-being. It goes to the heart of creation. Here is the key insight. The past is neurologically encoded as a pattern of neural pathways. It is not out there in the world. It is inside your head as an electrochemical structure. When you are thinking about the past, you are activating that structure and running it in the present moment. Similarly, the future does not yet exist. What you call thinking about the future is the brain-generating simulations based on current patterns. Both past and future are happening right now in the present moment as mental events. The present is where everything is actually occurring. It is the only ground where change can actually take root. This is why the practice of present moment awareness is not a retreat from responsibility or an avoidance of planning. It is precisely the opposite. When you are genuinely present, not dragging the past through your current experience or projecting the future onto it, you bring your full creative capacity to bear on what is actually here, right now, asking for your attention and your choice. The technique of present moment anchoring uses the body as the most reliable instrument for returning to now. The body does not exist in the past or the future. The sensation of breathing, the weight of your feet on the floor, the temperature of your hands, these are happening now, exclusively now, and attending to them immediately disrupts the brain's default drift into temporal displacement. Eckhart Tolle, whose work on presence has reached millions of readers, describes the practice in terms remarkably consistent with the neuroscience. Most humans are never fully in the present. They are living in mental abstractions. But the present moment is the only moment available to us, and it is the only door into the timeless. What the neuroscience adds to this is specificity. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of conscious choice and executive function, operates most effectively in a present-focused state. When the mind is in its default mode of past regret and future anxiety, the prefrontal cortex's resources are partially hijacked by the emotional circuitry associated with those temporal excursions. Present moment awareness frees up executive capacity. You think more clearly, you decide more wisely, you act more deliberately. Every thought you choose to think in this moment is a vote for the neural future you are building. Every time you bring your attention back to the present, even briefly, even imperfectly, you strengthen the prefrontal circuitry of deliberate choice and weaken the default mode circuitry of automatic reaction. The present moment is not an escape from your life. It is the only place your life is actually happening. It is the only ground on which anything real can be built. Advanced mental programming. By this point in the book, you understand the basic architecture. The subconscious mind runs on programs installed before you had the capacity to choose them. The programs filter reality to confirm themselves. The observer, your authentic, diffused awareness, can step outside the programs and choose differently. New patterns, rehearsed with emotion and repetition in the right neurological conditions, can become as automatic as the old ones. Now, let's go deeper. Advanced mental programming recognizes that there are multiple levels of identity, and that work done at the wrong level produces only surface-level change. You can change what you think while leaving unchanged what you believe you are. And belief about identity is the master template from which all other programming derives. Dr. Robert Dilts, a researcher and practitioner in the field of neuro-linguistic programming, developed a model of what he calls neurological levels of change. At the bottom of the hierarchy are your environment and behavior, the circumstances you're in, and the actions you take. Above those are capabilities, the skills and strategies you employ. Above those are beliefs and values, what you think is true and important. Above those is identity, who you believe yourself to be. And at the very top is purpose, the sense of meaning and mission that animates everything below it. Changes made at the environment or behavioral level, a new morning routine, a different job, a changed city, tend not to last unless the levels above them shift to support and consolidate the change. The person who changes their environment without changing their identity will eventually recreate the old environment because the identity is still generating the same behavioral patterns, the same choices, the same relationship dynamics. Real lasting transformation requires identity-level work. Identity-level programming begins with a single, unusually powerful question. Who am I when I'm not being what I was conditioned to be? Strip away the roles, professional title, relationship status, the descriptions people have used for you over the years. Strip away the stories, the narrative of who you've been and what has happened to you. What remains? What is the quality of awareness that persists through all of those changing contents? What remains is the observing self we have been building toward throughout this entire book. And the observing self has a different relationship to identity than the thinking self does. The thinking self identifies with its contents, its beliefs, its stories, its emotional patterns, its roles. The observing self recognizes that it is the container of all those things, not their accumulation. From the position of the observing self, identity becomes genuinely fluid. You are not your history. You are the awareness that experienced your history and continues beyond it. This is not a philosophical abstraction. It is a neurological description of what is actually happening when genuine psychological transformation occurs. When you shift your identity anchor from the person shaped by these specific past experiences to the conscious being who can choose which experiences to build on, you access a degree of creative freedom that most people never discover. Advanced visualization work at the identity level involves what practitioners call the future self technique. You construct a detailed, emotionally resonant representation of the version of yourself who has already made the transformation you are pursuing. Not what that person has or does, but who they are, how they move through the world, what they notice, how they respond to difficulty, how they hold themselves in moments of uncertainty. Then you visit that version of yourself regularly, in meditation, in the theta state window before sleep, in deliberate moments of visualization during the day. You ask that future self for guidance. You adopt their posture, their breathing, their emotional baseline. You begin to let that identity template influence the choices of today. This is not fantasy. It is a structured form of identity revision that uses the brain's capacity for neuroplasticity and temporal simulation to begin reorganizing your behavioral and emotional patterns around a more aligned version of who you actually intend to be. The final element of advanced mental programming is shadow integration, a concept borrowed from Jungian psychology and supported by substantial clinical evidence. The shadow refers to the aspects of yourself that your conditioning taught you to hide, disown, or deny. The anger you were told was inappropriate, the ambition you were taught was selfish, the vulnerability you learned was dangerous. These disowned aspects of self don't disappear when you deny them. They go underground, and from underground they exert enormous influence on your behavior, often in precisely the areas where you most want to change. The overly controlled person explodes. The generosity performer burns out from resentment. The self-deprecator secretly craves recognition and is quietly furious at not receiving it. Advanced mental programming requires bringing these shadow elements into the light of the observing self, not to indulge them unfiltered, but to integrate their energy constructively. The anger examined becomes boundary-setting capacity. The ambition, acknowledged, becomes focused drive. The vulnerability, accepted, becomes genuine connection. You cannot program over what you have not first acknowledged. Integration precedes transformation. Living as a conscious creator, we have covered a great deal of ground together. You now understand that the voice in your head is not you, that the reality you experience is a construction, not a transparent window onto objective truth, but a filtered, predicted, belief-shaped interpretation. That the brain you have today was built largely by conditioning you didn't choose, but that it remains genuinely plastic and capable of deep structural change at any age. That your thoughts are not commands you must obey, but events you can observe, evaluate, and relate to with deliberate choice. That the quantum dimension of consciousness participates in the selection of experience in ways science is only beginning to articulate. And you understand the practice at the center of all of this. Cognitive defusion, the capacity to step back from your thoughts into the position of the observing self and engage with your mental life from a place of deliberate, conscious agency rather than automatic, conditioned reaction. Now the question is what you do with all of this, because understanding is not the same as living it. The most eloquent map of a territory is not a substitute for walking the ground. And this territory, the inner landscape of your own consciousness, can only be truly navigated through direct, consistent, daily practice. Here is the fundamental commitment of the conscious creator. I will not accept my automatic thoughts as facts. I will not allow my conditioned emotions to constitute a verdict. I will not mistake the voice of my programming for the voice of my authentic self. I will instead bring the deliberate attention of the observing self to my experience, in good moments and difficult ones, in clear times and confused ones, in the small moments of daily life and the big moments of genuine decision. This is not a goal to reach. It is a practice to sustain. The morning ritual of the conscious creator begins with the first moment of waking. Before the phone, before the news, before the reactive cascade of the day begins. In that first window of hypnagogic receptivity, that rich, soft space where theta brainwaves still color the morning, you bring your attention deliberately to who you intend to be today. Not what you intend to accomplish, though that may follow. Who you intend to be. What quality of attention you intend to bring to the experience of being alive this day. This takes 5 minutes. It costs nothing, and done consistently, it changes the neurological template from which the rest of your day emerges. Throughout the day, the practice is one of ongoing noticing. You catch the thought loop arising and name it. You notice the fusion happening and step back into the observer. You feel the emotional weather moving through and allow it to move. Fully felt, fully experienced, but not identified with, not sustained through rumination. You make choices from the prefrontal position of deliberate agency rather than from the limbic position of automatic reaction. You will not do this perfectly. Nobody does. The measure of the practice is not perfection. It is how quickly you return to the observing position when you lose it, and you will lose it, repeatedly, because you are human and your conditioning is deep and the autopilot has been running for a very long time. Return quickly. Return without self-judgment. The self-judgment is just another thought. Observe it, label it, let it pass. The evening ritual of the conscious creator closes the loop. Before sleep, in that second theta window, that rich neurological moment, when the day's experience is being consolidated into memory, you spend a few minutes reviewing the day, not for its external events, but for its inner ones. Where did you stay conscious? Where did you drift into autopilot? Where did a thought run you before you noticed it? Where did you notice it and choose differently? Not to criticize, to learn, to calibrate, to set the intention for who you will practice being tomorrow. This practice accumulates. The neural pathways of conscious observation thicken. The pathways of automatic reaction thin, slowly, not linearly, not without setback, but undeniably. The baseline of your inner life shifts. The loops lose their power. The beliefs lose their invisible authority. The emotions move through more fluidly, experienced fully without being catastrophized. And in the space that opens up, something appears that may be unfamiliar at first. Genuine choice. Not the illusion of choice that the programmed mind offers, the simulation of agency within a system that is already decided, but real choice, rooted in awareness that is genuinely free of the automatic momentum of conditioning. From that freedom, you build differently. Not because your circumstances have necessarily changed, though they often do, as the prediction engine begins priming for new possibilities and the RAS begins filtering for different evidence. But because the person constructing the circumstances has changed, you are no longer building from the unconscious blueprint of your earliest programming. You are building from a conscious intention held by an aware observer, implemented through deliberate daily practice. The philosopher Epictetus, a former slave who became one of antiquity's most respected thinkers, said, "We cannot choose our external circumstances, but we can always choose how we respond to them." 2,000 years of philosophy, psychology, and neuroscience have added specificity to this truth without diminishing it. You can choose, not always easily, not without practice, but genuinely, deeply, with full neurological support. The hidden influence your thoughts have exerted over your life is not malevolent. The system was doing what it was built to do, keeping you safe, conserving energy, running efficiently on established patterns. But you have outgrown the need to be kept safe from your own possibilities. You have outgrown the limitations that were installed before you were old enough to consent to them. Your mind is magnificent, it is extraordinary, and it has been waiting, patiently, like all genuine potential waits, for you to step into the position of its conscious director rather than its unconscious subject. You are not your thoughts. You are the one who notices them. Everything possible begins there.